Okay, so I want to read you from a fantastic book by the author Shelby Steele, who teaches over at Hoover Institute. And the book is called White Guilt. And it really does explain, I think, in detail, the worldview that ends with the belief that all inequality of outcome is an evil in America, and explains why we are seeing these acts of religious penitence from the left, from the white left particularly, and why we are seeing the attempt to rip away American history. I mean, there was a George Washington statue that got torn down in Portland yesterday. This is all of a piece. So I never do this, but I think that this is a very important subject, and I'm going to let somebody who is more well-versed on this than I speak to you here. So Shelby Steele, again, in his book, White Guilt, he talks about white guilt. He says, white guilt is, quote, the vacuum of moral authority that comes from simply knowing that one's race is associated with racism. Whites and American institutions must acknowledge historical racism to show themselves redeemed of it. But once they acknowledge it, they lose moral authority over everything having to do with race, equality, social justice, poverty, and so on. They step into a void of vulnerability. The authority they lose transfers to the victims of historical racism and becomes their great power in society. So in other words, when you acknowledge the guilt, the white guilt, that white supremacy was a governing force in the United States, you immediately lose all authority to speak on moral questions. Okay? Because white guilt is a vacuum of moral authority, says Shelby Steele, it makes the moral authority of whites and the legitimacy of American institutions contingent on proving a negative, that they are not racist. Whites in American institutions are stigmatized as racist until they prove otherwise. White guilt leaves no room for moral choice. It does not depend on the goodwill or the genuine decency of people. It depends on their fear of stigmatization, their fear of being called a racist. Right? Because if you are called a racist, you lose moral authority. And you are linked to a past that you don't belong to, but because you are a member of the white race, you are therefore guilty by association with the people who were creators of these institutions and did exist in a regime of white supremacy. You combine this with the new redefinition of racism. So it used to be that you were guilty for your own racist act, right? For your own racist feelings. That was the Martin Luther King version of racism he was trying to wipe from the human heart, and largely was successful in doing so. Then there is the broader version of racism. Okay, the broader version of racism is an essentially Marxist version of racism, says Shelby Steele. Ugly human prejudices like racism did not just remain isolated in the hearts of racists. These dark passions worked by an invisible hand to generate societal structures that impersonally oppressed. As people simply conformed to mundane standards of social decency, they executed a bigotry and shaped society around it without feeling animus toward minorities. The Marxian emphasis on structures and substructures gave the new militant leaders of the time, is the 60s, an infinitely larger racism to work with, a systemic and sociological racism that was far more determinative than the simpler immoral racism of the Martin Luther King era. So the Martin Luther King racism says that America would be free except for these obstacles, institutional obstacles of racism. Get rid of the institutional obstacles of racism, Jim Crow laws, racism in interactions, and we will now be free. And now the freedom is on us, right? Responsibility is on us. Once you suggest that it has infused all of the institutions, and the institutions themselves define human beings, the only way to change the system is to rip down the institutions. And this is a very Marxist view of human life, that the institutions shaped you, that people did not shape the institutions, and that your fundamental decency within the context of an evil system does not change the evil system, right? You can say as much as you want, I'm not a racist, so long as you are part of an institutionally racist system. There is no getting away from the fact that simply by upholding the system, you are adhering to racism. Shelby Steele says globalized racism, this is the new definition of racism, is, quote, racism inflated into a deterministic, structural, and systemic power. Global racism seeks to make every racist event the tip of the iceberg, so that redress will be to the measure of the iceberg rather than to the measure of its tip, right? Because once you say that everything is infused with racism, all you have to do is point to a hotspot like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, and then say that this is the entire United States writ small, right? That's the tip of the iceberg. Now we have to attack the structures. It is a reconceptualization of racism designed to capture the fruit of the new and vast need in white America for moral authority in racial matters. And this is really the key, right? The basic idea here is that if white people are suffering from racial guilt because, as they should, they look to the history of the United States and are ashamed by white supremacy, that if that is the case, the way that white people, particularly white liberals, seek to reestablish moral authority is to prove that they are not racist. And the way to prove that they are not racist is by standing aside from the institutions that supposedly are shot through with racism. So dissociation becomes the key. Dissociation and labeling and cancel culture, these become a key. By the way, Shelby Steele was writing this in 2006. He says, suddenly, in American life, the matter of responsibility was qualified by a new social morality. If you were black and thus a victim of racial oppression, this new morality of social justice meant you could not be expected to carry the same responsibilities as others. Right? In other words, because of social justice and the history of racial oppression, we can't expect you not to loot, right? That's the piece in the New York Times. The point was that American society no longer had the moral authority to enforce a single standard of responsibility for everyone because By its own admission, it had not treated everyone the same. Thus, in the national consciousness after the 60s, individual responsibility became synonymous with injustice when applied to blacks. Thus, since the 60s, black leaders have made one overriding argument that blacks cannot achieve equality without white America taking responsibility for it. Okay, and this just suits white liberals to a T. The idea that equality can only be established if they are given the power to restructure American society, because it invests them again with moral authority, the moral authority they've lost because of white guilt. So now they have the power to restructure American society, and it's great. Not only do they get to show that they are better than other white people for having accepted white guilt, they also then get to restructure institutions without actually caring what happens to black people who are harmed by the restructuring of those institutions. This is why you see so many white upper crust liberals in Hollywood tweeting about defund the police when they won't be affected by defund the police one iota. This leads, as Shelby Steele says, to white blindness, a blindness to the human reality of minorities that occurs when whites look at racial issues but see only the contingency they must meet to restore their own moral authority. In other words, what do I have to do to make myself feel better and make me feel like I'm on top of the moral pantheon again? White blindness is an unconscious self-absorption by which whites see racial issues and even interracial encounters as opportunities to dissociate from historic racism. Every time you interact with a black person, it's an opportunity for you to show that you are not a racist and therefore recapture your moral authority. And of course, you can't recapture your moral authority unless you rip the entire system, which, as we have said, is an indicator of globalized racism. Dissociation requires evidence of a proactive effort, a self-conscious and highly visible display. This is all Shelby Steele. And again, I'm reading to you at length here because I think that he expresses this so much more eloquently than I would. He says, people who are in the grip of white blindness and thus unaware of their true motivations always miss the human being inside the black skin. Your color represents you in the mind of such people. They will have built a large part of their moral identity and possibly their politics around how they respond to your color. Thus, a part of them, the moral part, is invested not in you, but in some idea of what your color means. And when they see you, the individual, you a black person, they instantly call to mind this investment and determine once again to honor it. They're very likely proud of the way they've learned to relate to your color, proud of the moral magnanimity it gives them an opportunity to express. So in meeting you, they actually meet only a well-rehearsed and better part of themselves. This is the sort of pretension that Jordan Peele mocks in Get Out. The people who are walking around with kente cloths and saying they voted for Obama twice. Says Shelby Steele, in the age of white guilt, white blindness has been driven not by racism, but by the white need to dissociate from racism. Whites are blind to blacks as human beings today, not out of bigotry, but out of their obsession with achieving the dissociation they need to restore their moral authority. And when they find a way to dissociate from racism, diversity, politically correct language, political liberalism itself, there's little incentive to understand blacks as human beings.